So welcome back, everybody, to another webinar organized by Princeton University's BCF. We're very happy to have Erik Hurst with us from Chicago booth. Hi, Erik.
Hello.
So Erik will talk about the US labor market during the COVID crisis, and he will have some exciting data and new evidence from most recent events, and we will look forward to his presentation. As usual, I would like to give some introductory remarks, and I start with, looking back what we did do last Monday. Last Monday, we had Philip Lane, the chief economist of the European Central Bank, with us, and he was explaining the pandemic emergency purchasing program, its role, how does it compare to the QE measures, how does it compare to other measures like OMT, and so forth, and conventional monetary policy. Today, Erik will talk about US labor market, some real-time evidence from payroll data. And on Monday, Arvind Krishnamurthy will talk about corporate debt overhang and credit policy. Next Friday is 4th of July weekend in the United States, so we will not have a webinar next Friday. So sorry for that. Hope you can live without a Friday with the webinar, and I hope to see you then subsequent Monday again. Now let me dive into the topic, and I have to admit I'm not a labor economist, so I come from outside, but I'm interested in this topic. So if you look at the US labor market, you see the unemployment rate. I plotted it here from the BLS data from 2000 onwards. And you see during the great financial crisis in 2008, you see a sharp rise from about 5% unemployment rate to more than 10% unemployment rate. But you see an unprecedented spike in May 2020 or April 2020, and then it came down a little bit in May 2020. So it went almost 15% and came down to 13-something%. So what's striking is the level. We have never seen such a level, and also the speed at which it went up. So what I want to do is I would like to contrast this with the European unemployment rate, and the guess, what's your guess how the European unemployment rate has changed? And I put it roughly, that's from Eurostat, the data, and I put it on the same scale. So 10% corresponds to 10% here, and so forth. And what you see is that, of course, the Euro crisis, the unemployment rate was heightened as well. On average, the European unemployment rate is slightly higher, whether you talk about the Euro area or the whole European Union. So the whole European Union is the blue one, and the Euro area is the yellow one. But if you look at the spike, the current crisis, it's way smaller compared to what we have seen in the United States. So there's no comparison to that. And even though the COVID crisis started earlier in Europe, in particular in Italy, but you don't see the same type of spike. And the question is, what is going on? Why is it so different? Why are the data so different across the two continents? And I would like to say it's because of strategic unemployment. And what is strategic unemployment? I just invented this term because it's related to like strategic default in the finance literature. And the US has a very different institutional structure than the Europeans have. The US is very much focused on unemployment benefits. Once you break the link between the employer and employee, you get an unemployment benefit, while Europe is very much focused on Kurzarbeit, which is short-term work, which means you keep your connection with the employee, and you get then through the employee, you get some payment, but it's subsidized heavily by the government or some social security scheme. So what is the case that you have a lot of unemployment here, but it's strategic unemployment in the United States, because that's how the subsidies, that's a way you get the subsidies. You have to go to an unemployment state in order to get the subsidy. And the question is, how do you measure then the true unemployment rate, which is the true one, and how do you compare it across continents or across countries, different unemployment rates? How do you interpret the Phillips curve if the unemployment rate is distorted? Again, the big difference is you break up the job worker match in the US system, but you keep it, maintain it in the job worker match in the European system. Of course, the PPP in the US is trying to do the same thing as well. And you break up the job worker match in the US, but there's a strong expectations by many of these workers that they will be rehired back by the same employer. So that's a recent paper presented yesterday by Bartik, Patron, Finn, Rothstein, and Unrath, where there's essentially they show that they come back to the same employers, or at least the expectations are very high, and the expectations are to a large extent correct as well. Now, what we need, this suggests we need essentially a new type of labor matching model. So that's something for labor modeling, like Rob Scheimer and others, to figure out the old models more or less you have matched and unmatched guys on the job, and some guys have no job. But you might have another state variable to introduce where you said you have some guys who will be rehired potentially by the same employer they were worked for before. And when you go for a different employer, then actually the initial match is actually totally broken. There are two levels of being broken. First, you are fired, but there's a hope you will be rehired. But if you now join to a different firm, then it's really broken, the initial match. And that's, there's a nice model to be written in this space. I haven't seen anything, perhaps it exists already, but it would be nice to see it. You could also then unify the different statistics across Europe and in the United States. And it's also interesting in a sense that, when would you exploit the strategic unemployment and the benefits? You would do this primarily in large recessions and very deep recessions, because you said, the likelihood that the worker will then go to another firm is very low because, the whole economy is a huge recession. Nobody will hire anyway. So I can just exploit the benefits coming from the unemployment insurance this way. So that's one way to see this, what is going on in the United States. And it might be seen as, the numbers are way too high. And then if the unemployment rates go back, as it happened in May, it's not a big victory of some policy measures or something else. It's just a distorted statistic to some extent. Now, there's also a big discussion now going on. Is it, skill mismatch? We had the earlier skill mismatch debate during the global financial crisis. Now is it the COVID crisis primarily a reallocation stock? And there's a new paper by Barrero, Nick Bloom, and Stephen Davis, who argued that 32 to 42% of the unemployed jobs won't come back. So you have essentially in the US, you have a huge reallocation. And the argument they're making is that, we're experimenting with many new things at the home offices and telemedicine and so forth. And that will lead to a totally different landscape. And hence there will be a reallocation. And that's not, the rehiring is actually not so important. There's another aspect I would like to emphasize is that if you lose your match, so if you're fired, you might be rematched with something else, but the rematch might be actually worse than the initial match, and then it might be very hard to go back to the initial match as well. So it's not clear that all reallocation is actually beneficial. If you do this mechanism where you go, I will be fired, hoping come back, but you don't come back fast enough. In the meantime, you accept another job, which is not as good as the original job, but then once you're in the new job, it might be very hard to go back to the original job as well. So there might be some rematches which are actually worse than the initial match. In generally, there's another dimension in which you can enrich the labor models, and perhaps it's already done, that shows my ignorance, that you have some match-specific investments. So, and then the question is, I have some particular match with a university, they invest in me and I invest in them, and we do very match specific, which is not transferable to any other new firm or new employer. And the question is, who is investing more, the employer or the employee? Are these costs which we have to do all up front, or are there costs which are accumulating over time as we have worker-employer relationship and so forth? So these are all interesting, many new things coming up with this new data, and you can actually then interpret this data much more in a deeper sense. And the authors have this fantastic data, and Erik will talk about them. I have to explain it here. Now, another aspect you can look at with this data is, what is about when you fire, when you cut wages. So you can, as a firm, you can cut wages in order to reduce your cost, or you can fire the worker altogether. And during the Euro crisis, what we have seen actually in the peripheral countries, that there were a lot of reductions in wage bills because the number of hours were actually extended. You got the same wage, but you had to work more hours. Or the bonus payments went down, or normally you got a 13th month salary, you didn't get it anymore. All this holidays were reduced and all this, there was a lot of implicit wage reduction. And the authors have a very nice paper, which is a different paper about how flexible bonus wages as a bonus component of wages are in particular. And they probably will allude to this as well. But one aspect I would like to highlight here is the wage stickiness. And that's what this paper of the authors do, the previous paper. But it might be very different between a slow-moving recession and a fast recession. So you might have some wage stickiness, in particular on the base wage, and the Keynesian insights might work there. But for a fast recession, there might be a much more wage flexibility. The wage cut might be much more dramatic. So the more classical insights, or what I think, financial frictions might matter much more, because debt contracts, they're all denominated in nominal terms, and that might be the driver rather than wage stickiness, because for fast recessions, it's very, very easy to cut wages, and that's essentially leading us to different type of recessions. You have slow-moving recessions, which have a different dynamics and different frictions driving the recessions compared to fast-moving recessions. And that would be interesting to use this data as well to contrast this as well. Another thing you could do is to test for different types of wage stickiness and price stickiness. There are different theories out there. So this most commonly used in macro models is the Calvo stickiness, that you cannot change wages at all or prices at all. You just have to have a Calvo ferry has to touch on your shoulders, and then you can change the prices. You can have a menu cost approach, a Golosov-Lucas type, or more general, some other approach. Or you can have sticky information or inattention approach like Menke and Rice. And there's some paper by Makiewicz and Mönch and Wiederholt, which use different price adjustment across different sectors and try to discriminate this. And the authors have some experience on this dimension as well. And this might be another way to really go after wage stickiness using this particular episode where you have this fast-moving recession compared to a slow-moving earlier recessions, how they differ in many dimensions here, and what theories, underlying macro theories, are the key theories we have to understand in order to understand the macroeconomy. Now, finally, I would like to go to inequality and the future of work on the last slide before I move to my regular poll. What we have seen from Raj Chetty's webinar and his team when they were presenting their work is that the poor in rich neighborhoods, they were hit especially hard. So what really matters is the city level inequality. And that would be interesting to see. The authors can probably, they have some zip code, I guess, as well, and they can follow this up as well to see where that's occurring as well. Now, for me, one of the most interesting aspects in labor, besides all the macro issues we talked about earlier, is to rethinking the future of work and rethinking the freelancing model. And, we have a big movement towards much more freelancing. The old traditional firm worker employment arrangement is not really where the whole economy is moving. And typically we have a setting where the firm is taking on some insurance role to insure the worker and give him some certainty that he has a continued income over time. And we move to a much more freelancing model where the insurance role is actually going away. And sticky wages is to some extent part of an insurance contract. If the economy tanks, I will not immediately cut your wage. So there's an insurance contract on top of the wage contract. And if the shock is very large, I will fire you, and then some other unemployment insurance has to kick in. So this job security aspect, which Angus Deaton mentioned in his webinar as one of, the job security going back, and it causes a lot of disharmony and displeasure of many, many people in the society. That's essentially something we have to think about. Will this go back? Will we go back from the current trend where we go to a freelance model, or will we come back after COVID saying we have to go back to a more traditional setting? So let me stop at this and stop as usual with a poll. And here are the poll questions today. If you compare the US unemployment insurance, the US model, which is all about breaking the links and easing the reallocation later on, versus the European Kurzarbeit model, and it's US as well, the PPP, which one of the two do you think is the better one to go for? That's the first question, got to get a sense from the audience. The second question is, how big do you think is there the COVID crisis primarily a reallocation shock, and I would like to pick a number to say, okay, more than 30% of the layoffs, of the COVID-induced layoffs, will be permanent or not. What's your take on that? Will it be more than 30%? So get a take on from the audience. The third question is about the future of work, rethinking the freelancing or sharing economy. So do you think, yes, we have to rethink it, and we will return to more traditional employer-employee arrangements, insurance against wage cuts, because wages are sticky, and then if once you're fired, there will be, of course, there's huge uncertainty for firing, there will be unemployment insurance. Or we can come for some other arrangement, we go to freelancing, but then there will be some private insurance companies providing some insurance because you need some certainty, and that will be provided not by the employer, but by some other private insurance companies, some new financial markets popping up. Do you think that's the future to go? Or do you think, the old trend, like the Uber economy we have seen, that's essentially the way forward and we don't need any insurance at all? And the fourth question is, with COVID has shown that certain jobs are really crucial for society. If you're a nurse or if you help out, you do services for society. And it seems like some of them are extremely crucial, but not well paid. And people have recognized, there has to be some more appreciation going on as well. And do you think this will be reflected in wages down the road? Yes or no? So let me run the poll for a little bit longer, but you have another 10, 15 seconds. So you have to speed up if you want to vote. Okay, now, do you think, a quick summary, the unemployment insurance, the US way of breaking up the links or the European way of keeping the links? 35% think, breaking up the links and easing restructuring is a better way to go. 65% think the European way with Kurzarbeit and also the US PPP arrangement is the way to go to preserve the links rather than breaking them up. Is the COVID crisis a reallocation shock? 64% think, yes, it is a reallocation shock. More than 30% of the layoffs will not come back. So it will be permanent. And only 36% think, no, it is not a reallocation shock of that size. It's lower than 30%. But the future of work, should we rethink how the whole economy is structured? Should we rethink it? And so 51% think, yes, we should rethink it and return to the more traditional arrangement. So 51% think want to go back to the old arrangement. 27% thinks, yes, we should also rethink it, but we have to substitute the unemployment insurance with some private insurance arrangement to keep more freelancing, but the freelancing people, they have to find some other insurance, only 27%. And only 22% think we should go back to the Uber economy, not having any insurance provided at all. And finally, should we have a revaluation of the relative wages across the different sectors, across the different jobs? And 75%, it's a very high number, I think we have to reevaluate that. And only 25% think the current arrangement of the wage levels in the cross-section is the appropriate one. So with this, I will leave the screen to Erik. Thanks again, Erik, for being with us and for presenting your work.
Thank you so much. Let me get to my slides here.
And I should say, please leave your questions in the Q&A box. We will ask them, and Erik's co-authors are here as well to answer these questions right away. I will also pick up some of these questions and challenge Erik with them.
Perfect. I have many thoughts on Markus's introduction. I will leave some of those to the end. But I think at its heart, what Markus was saying is, what can we learn about the labor market in general from the shock that we're experiencing recently? And in order to answer that question, what kind of data could we bring to bear? And I think this paper is a data paper primarily. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about what the data is, why we're writing the paper, and then show you some of the findings. I do have to say, because I have a few co-authors from the Federal Reserve Board, that these are our own opinions and not theirs, the Federal Reserve Board. Okay, So we're going to have data from ADP, and some of you have seen me use this ADP data in the past for some of my other work. It is a payroll processing company that processes about 1/6 of all payroll in the United States. And so if you're a firm like the University of Chicago, you hire a payroll processor. We don't use ADP, we use an ADP competitor at the University of Chicago, but they process all the payroll. I think the University of Minnesota might use ADP. Princeton, I think, processes the payroll in-house. So there's these payroll processes out there, and so what we have is administrative data on every worker's wage, earnings, which is different than their wage, bonuses, overtime, etc. We have administrative measures of hours for hourly workers, and we have just counts of who's being paid, so we can measure employment. So in this paper, we're going to look at the time series in the administrative data from ADP on employment in the aggregate and by a bunch of different groups. We're going to look in detail at what's happening to the wage distribution. We're going to look at hours. We're going to look at firm dynamics, business shutdown, firm reentry, and whether they're recalling the same employees or hiring new employees. With that, we'll be able to look at some job creation and job destruction numbers to try to get at the reallocation aspects that Markus was alluding to. And then we could use some of the high frequency stuff to look at what happens when states reopen in certain sectors, to try to get a sense of how much of employment changes are due to things like constraints on employment, the workers have to, or firms have to shut down, versus how much is going to be from demand. Even when restaurants are open, you and I just don't want to go to restaurants. So that's at the broad of what we're going to do. So one question that I think about when I see papers like this is, why are we getting into the measurement business when we have many government sources out there that measures some of the same things? And so when you think about the BLS, they have a survey of firms, they have a survey of workers that measures labor market outcomes. And I think the benefit of the ADP data is a few. Just in the scale, I already told you, it's about 1/6 the US workforce. So our samples are going to have, 20 to 30 some million workers just during this time period. It's nationally representative. I'll talk about that more in a second. But I think the benefits are a couple. So we have linked employer-employee data, at least for the firms that contract with ADP. So we see firms, we see workers, and we could track worker flows across those firms. We could see what types of workers each firms are hiring. We could see which types of workers firms are letting go. And then we could see if those workers are coming back. So to understand recall, these linked employer-employee data in real time gives us some benefit over what I would call the traditional BLS data sources. As you've seen in my other work with John Grigsby and Ahu Yildirim's, we also have administrative data on wages. So we have contracted hourly earnings for hourly workers. We have contracted annual salary per pay period for salary workers. And if you want to do high frequency analysis on nominal wage adjustments, having a data free of measurement error is very important. And so we've used some of that in our other work, but we can observe some of those in this current environment. And again, the large sample and high frequency with demographic variables allows for some cross-location variation if people are interested in the effects of state policies on the labor market in real time. So, we don't come to this lightly, in the sense that all of the authors separately have been working with the ADP data for about a half a decade or so. So the Fed team has been showing the power of the ADP data to measure the labor market and just employment counts, and to use that in policy making for the last 4 or 5 years. And they have many papers on this, showing that the ADP data is representative of the US labor market. So this is a series they put together in some of their other work, which shows the ADP series in red, just the raw data, not even reweighted, which I'll talk about in a second, against the current employment statistics data from the 2006 through 2020, and you can see, it's picking up a lot of signal in the measurement of the aggregate labor market. Once we rate to make it a little bit more representative by firm size in industry, it matches even more closely. So, the ADP data is not completely representative. Some really big firms do payroll in-house. Some really small firms don't pay the fixed cost to contract with ADP, and they use other types of options. But to a first approximation, and all the work they've done in their work, and me and John and Ahu and our work on wage stickiness shows the ADP data is quite representative along a variety of labor market outcomes. And so that's good for us now when we go into this period to give us some confidence that the ADP data is representative of the U.S. economy. So I have two caveats before I start showing you some results. And I'm going to show you lots of data on employment during the last few months in the ADP data. And I just want to tell you what we actually measure for this. So we have two data sets. We have one of all firms that contract with ADP, and we have a separate one of all firms or all employees in the ADP data that links to their firm. The second sample, the employee level sample, this is some of the small firms. The firm level data has all firms representative of the firm distribution, and I'm going to go back and forth between them. But the key thing I want to mention is we're going to measure employment by receipt of a paycheck. And so some workers are paid at different frequencies. I'm paid monthly, some people are paid weekly, others are paid bi-weekly, some are paid semi-monthly. And what that does is it creates a little bit of lag in the timing in terms of when we are going to measure an employment loss relative to when it might have happened. So consider a bi-weekly worker, and most of the sample is bi-weekly, who gets paid in every odd week. And suppose that worker is displaced in period T. We're still going to observe that worker getting paid in T+1, so we're going to count them as being employed there, and we wouldn't be able to observe them as missing from the data set into week T+3. And so we're going to impute them as losing their job from the last time we saw them with their paycheck. They didn't work after T+1, but there's a little bit of noise given that they actually lost their job in T. So why do I bring that up? I'm going to show you some high frequency analysis, and we have to realize there might be some measurement error for about a week or so in some of their imputations that we do. So, second caveat I'm going to mention before I show you some pictures.
Erik, can you just contrast with the BLS? They have similar problems, or it's only for you guys?
So the BLS is going to ask firms how many workers are on their payroll during that second week of March. And so those are going to be more of an active employment at that time. So I don't think they're going to have as much of that problem as we are. So you're going to call the firm on the phone and say, hey, how many employees do you got? And they're going to measure the stock of the employees that they have at that moment. Now, they might have fired somebody on a Tuesday and this question comes on a Friday, or vice versa. Or the question comes on a Tuesday and they might have fired somebody on a Friday. So there is a little bit of timing even there for high frequency stuff, but I think it's more with the payroll data than not. But even, I'm going to defer one more answer to that in a second.
How many firms do they ask to do the survey, just for the audience to?
Yeah, that's perfect.
You have 1/6 of all the firms in the US?
1/6 of all firms, yep.
And how many does the BLS? How many firms?
So it's about in terms of employment, Ryan will know the answer to this at the end, but I think our sample sizes are about the same as the CES. The difference between the BLS is it's a complete, sample in a random sense. These are going to be people who contract with ADP. So, but the BLS is going to have a more random. I think the orders of magnitudes of about, we have a sample of about 30 million workers. I think there's 30 million workers or so covered in the current employment statistics, give or take a little. Okay. So I want to mention one other thing. There's other papers out there using administrative data sets. We saw one in this seminar from Raj a couple weeks ago. And I think there, the selection issues are probably going to be a much more severe than they are in the ADP. And again, when Raj was up here, he acknowledged this completely. There's work done by Bartik and all. They acknowledge this as well. But these are data that, a lot of data coming now from this home-based data set. And just so for people who know, this is a free, mostly free. There's a peered level as well, but it's a free time clock data that firms could contract for their workers to check clock in and clock out. It's almost exclusively for small businesses, almost all the masses for businesses with less than 50 employees, and almost all of it is going to be in the restaurant industry. About 2/3 of those firms that report in industry are in restaurants. And so, some of the work we've done, I bring this up only because some of the patterns we're going to show are going to be quantitatively and qualitatively similar to these other data sets. Others are going to be qualitatively similar but quantitatively different in ways consistent with some selection, and others are going to be even quantitatively or qualitatively different. And I'll try to flag those when they come up, but I just want to kind of say some of these other data sets out there are going to be less representative of the labor market. And Raj, when he was here last week, acknowledged that, and in his talk to us in this seminar, he focused almost everything on the spending results that don't have those selection problems. Okay, so those are the two caveats in the background. So let me just kind of show you some results. So this is just a time series of employment measures in the BLS, not the BLS, in the ADP data, anchoring everything, and most of the figures I show you in the paper today will be anchored towards mid-February level. So you think about these as percent deviations of employment relative to mid-February. The solid line is from the paycheck data. It's going to be who was paid during that month by these firms. It's going to include all firms in the data. And some of this movement, and we'll highlight this in a few minutes, is going to be because firms are exiting the sample. And we'll ask how much of this employment decline is from exit. The dashed line is going to be a separate measure, which is going to get at a little bit at the question Markus was asking in his introduction of how much do we expect recall to be important in the long run. The dashed line is what ADP has as active employment. What that is when firms say, these are workers that are currently on our payroll books, but we're just not paying them this week. So temporary layoffs are one of the big differences between the dashed lines in the solid line. With the solid line being, these are people who aren't getting paid. These are people who are literally still matched with the firm. The black line shows that we lost about 20% of employment through late April. And if we go to the BLS week, so the BLS weeks are kind of mid-April here and mid-May there. As we talk about in the paper, the massive thunderstorms coming through Chicago. So if people hear that in the background now, you will hear that the thunder rolling. But the employment losses we're getting are very close to the BLS numbers. And so when the BLS last week or a few weeks ago showed an employment increase in their data, we are getting roughly similar employment increases in the BLS data. And I only bring that up because there was some discussion out there, even among policymakers, about whether the BLS was measuring what it was supposed to be measuring. And just at least from the ADP data, we're getting roughly similar numbers. And if you put these in numbers of jobs lost, I think we're getting something like 24 million jobs lost in the private sector through late April and a 7 million bounce back between late April, or maybe it was 26 million and then 7 million bounce back through May. So there's been a lot of paid employment recovery in the last few weeks, but again, the BLS has that as well. I only paused to mention that, again, you get this from BLS numbers, just because there was some discussion of whether the BLS was measuring things accurately. I don't know if we're measuring things accurately. All I'm saying is the numbers we're getting is the same. That might give some confidence in the BLS numbers and maybe ours as well. These are pictures you've seen before, but just to kind of focus on the magnitude, I'm going to focus on the left-hand side here. It's employment losses in paid employment by firm size. And so not surprising, you've seen this as well. Most of the job loss, or not most, there was a more job loss among small businesses than there was in medium and large businesses. but there's also been much more of the rebound has been driven by small businesses rather than big businesses. These little wiggles are due to differences in pay frequency. When we use the employee data, where we can control for each worker's scheduled pay frequency, these little wiggles kind of smooth out. Okay. So again, most of this is known already. It's interesting to see the magnitudes. Most of this is known as well. I just want to focus on a couple of things. So these are employment declines. Yeah, go ahead, Marcus.
So I shouldn't think of any standard errors around that. That's pure data, essentially.
This is just pure data. We got big samples. For some of the things we do later, we put standard errors on these, but these are, movements of our sample is going to be, 26 million, workers or so going through. But, no, there's no standard errors on this. It's just raw means of the data in index form.
So do you have a theory why the small firms cut back and rehired? Why is it?
Yeah, so give me some of that on the next slide. We're going to see a lot of the shutdown. We're going to be in things like restaurants, and some of this is going to be associated to some of those scaling up in nail salons and such opening up recently. There is, just to be fair, increases in all, but it is disproportionately in small firms. And I think some of that is going to be related to, there were certain sectors that are predominantly small firms that opened up very, recently. And
now, what I find surprising is that you end up at the end at the same point.
Yeah, that is something. Yeah, we get that in both our firm and employee data, where as of most recent data of late May, all of them are still about 15 percentage points decline relative to the beginning. Now, just to keep this in background, this is massive, and Marcus mentioned this earlier. We lost in total about 8% employment or 7% employment during the Great Recession at its peak. We're still 15% is a massive amount for all firm sizes, but it is much more homogeneous in firm size employment losses now than it was in late April. And I think some of that's going to do to the shuttering of some of the sectors. And I could actually show you that. That's what I wanted to show you on the next slide. So we're going to see the first column is employment losses by sector through over the whole period. And now I also, through the whole period and through the trough. So this first column is through late April. Here is through late May. The difference between them is the rebound that occurred between late April and late May. And you can see what I was telling Marcus, a lot of the gains were coming in things like accommodation and food services and retail trade, other services. The nail salons are in there as well. Now, manufacturing and construction and healthcare also had relatively big gains through this time period. Many states had manufacturing, shuttered a little bit. Some of the manufacturing, some of it was essential services, but by basically throughout the whole country, almost all sectors, all manufacturing industries were opened in early May. There's some exceptions to that, but the restaurants and other things were more staggered. Manufacturing and construction came back everywhere to the extent that it was closed in early May. And healthcare is seeing a big rebound as you start getting these, other operations and, allowing, checkups and things like that to occur within the healthcare sector. But if you take a look at transportation and education, both of which we haven't seen big increases in Ubers or airlines, or schools haven't been opening up much, you haven't seen much rebound in those sectors. So some of this pattern that Mark has highlighted is just the sectors that tended to be open, particularly these sectors tend to be smaller on average than some of the other ones. Okay. I'm going to show you two other pictures, and then I'm going to get into the distributional stuff. Some of these have already been known. There's other works. Albanese has some of this, Michel Terlet. The declines in employment for women have been larger than for men. That's different than in other past recessions. And the one thing we add to this is we could show very little of it is due to firm characteristics. So you might suggest that women are more likely to work in restaurants than men, as opposed to manufacturing, which tends to be men more than women. Conditional on 3-digit, 2-digit industries, we find no differential. It explains very little of the differential. Maybe about, a half a percentage point of this 4 percentage point difference. So that's just all we can, I'm going to state it as is, but very little of that gap is due to firm characteristics. In this picture you've seen in some of our other work. This paper hasn't changed. This picture hasn't changed much since we released the first draft of our paper, which had data through here. The job losses for the bottom of the distribution are much, much larger than they are from the top of the distribution. And that happens in all recessions, but in this recession, we're talking, we lost almost, just a little bit, like 37% of employment at its peak for workers in the bottom quintile of the wage distribution. So we rank workers by wage quintile in early February and then just track over time. And you could just see it plummets relative to the top. Okay, and very little of this is due to industry or firm characteristics as well. About 1/5 of the gap between the rich and the poor could be explained by things like, lower wages in some service sectors going forward. Okay. One more descriptive that else I'm going to say. We look at hours worked for hourly workers. There doesn't seem to be much trend. So almost all the adjustment is on the extensive margin, not on the intensive margin, at least for hourly workers. We don't have measures of meaningful hours for salaried workers. So I'm just going to leave it at that. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a couple other pictures, which then...
Can you look at regional differences as well? And when the crisis moves, the health crisis moves now to Texas and all this, do you see patterns on this? And also,
yes, so I'm going to show you some of those at the end, but more for the opening, not for the closing. But yeah, let me defer to some of the cross-region stuff to the end because we have some stuff on that, but we could do more. What I can tell you about hours is that in some sectors, hours did move. It's just that in most they didn't. So we looked at the restaurant industry or some of the kind of leisure and the arts, entertainment, recreation industries. You did see meaningful hours declines in those sectors as well. But most others, you did not. Like manufacturing, we didn't see much movement in hours conditional on manufacturing producing. Okay. So let me just show a couple of pictures on how much of the decline is due to business exit versus continuing firms. So this is the picture. Suppose we take continuing firms. In our data, what am I going to classify as a continuer as? Firms that keep making regularly scheduled employment or payroll, at least for some workers during all periods. So if you're a firm that pays every other week their workers, I'm going to make sure you keep making your regularly, you paid somebody in T+1, you paid somebody in T+3, etc. And I'm going to define exit from our sample as you did not make a regularly scheduled payroll period. And so in our data, and I'll show you the decomposition in numbers in a second, you can see a lot of employment decline was among continuing firms. So they kept paying somebody, they paid less workers, as opposed to firm exit. And I'll break this down but in a slide, but just to preview, it's about 2/3 to 80%, depending upon the period, of employment losses are going to be in continuing firms. Before I do that breakdown for you, let me just kind of show you there is a tremendous amount of heterogeneity, as you can imagine, in firm size growth over this period. So what we have here is we have the percentile of employment growth from mid-February through the end of May by firm size. And you can see for big firms, they've shrunk at the 10th percentile by about 90%. What does that mean? That means on average, they took all their workers and they only have about 10% of their workers left. So there's some firms that are almost effectively shutting down. They might have kept an accountant on the books or the manager on the books, but they let all their workers go. That's in our continuing firm definition. We're not going to count that as shutdown, but this gives you the whole distribution. And the key thing I want you to focus on is there's about 1/3 of firms that didn't have any meaningful employment losses. And then there are about 10 to 20% of firms that have actual employment gains during this period, about 10% of big firms and about 20% of smaller firms had some employment gains during this period. So this is the heterogeneity that Nick Bloom and Steve Davis have been talking about in some of their work. We can see exactly that in our data. There were some firms that were growing even meaningfully during the last few months. So this is just a decomposition of how much of the total employment decline. This is what I gave you in the first slide. In paid employment, about 21% of the paid employment went away. It's about 15% now. How much of that is going to be due to continuers, which is what I showed you on that other slide. How much is going to come from firms that have ever shut down? And then the second column is conditional on shut down ever, have they re-entered? And then we also do have a little bit of new entry into our data. What new entry means is, you know, ADP is either picking up some new clients or seasonal workers, people who didn't have payroll in, you know, January and February are starting to come back at some other time. So we can decompose all of these numbers, sum to the decline we get for the total. And I only bring that up is that so I could do a decomposition of how much of employment declines through the trough, and then how much of the gains from the trough through the current period are coming from different types of firms. And this is what I told you about before. About 80% of the employment declines are continuing firms. About 30% of the employment declines are due to exiting firms at the trough, and then there was a little bit due to kind of new entrants in the ADP data. So again, exit is playing a pretty substantive role, and it's playing even more of a role in the employment gains that we're getting from late April to late May. So about 35% of all the employment gains that we're getting is coming from firms that previously exited in bringing back workers.
I can ask you, if I want to join ADP, how quickly can I call them up and say, from next week onwards, you will do my payroll, or does it wait?
Yeah, I think it takes a couple of weeks. And I think very little of this, and this is something we could look at, these are not too much new firms. There's not much new firm creation occurring through much of this period. There is some new firms being created over here. Here, job creation, at least some of the stuff that Haltwanger has found, was pretty flat. Okay, there was record lows on business startup. I think most of what entry is in our data is going to be firms that are seasonal, that contract with ADP, that went away for a while. They weren't there in January and February, but they are coming back, but they would have come back in every year. And you can see that's kind of what our new entry mark is. And it's, because you could see some of this was gaining even before the recession started. So I think some of this is just, some new businesses, but I think some of it is just seasonal workers coming back in terms of, we can check.
New entry also means these are not new firms, just new contracts with ADP.
These are new contracts with ADP. So births is probably not, the ADP is probably not the best place to look at birth, because you might start for a while before you start contracting with ADP.
Okay.
Okay, so this is just by firm size. I'm just going to show you two pictures quickly. What this solid line is currently shut down, not ever shut down. What I showed you before was the ever shut down. This is currently shut down. So these are firms that were around in mid-February. Now, whether those firms are shut down or not, and you see there's a big increase in shutdown among small firms, and some of those have come back. And so this is what Marcus's question early on, why is the big difference between small firms? You're seeing a lot of small firms re-entering, about 8% of all of the employment gains in small firms. Again, 8% of the employment in February was in small firms. Were in firms that shut down that re-entered. And if you look at large firms that have shut down and re-entered, you're just not getting much employment gains there. So a lot of the time series patterns we saw in this figure is because firms have shut down. Now these small firms are coming back. Okay, not all of them. I mean, there's still, if you show the pictures, I should never flip back and forth. There's still 10% of employment in firms that have shut down. Okay, but it used to be 15%. So you're getting some of this shutdown coming back.
So some questions come from the audience. When they hire back the workers, they hire exactly the same workers back they were fired before? And what type of workers do you have data on that? Is it more the higher productivity workers? Or
those are exactly the next slides. I'm going to go look at what type of workers are bringing back. So I'm going to do it in two steps. First, I'm going to see when firms come back at, what size do they come back at? And then I want to be able to look at which workers in the firms they are bringing back. And then I'll be able to say for continuing firms, when they start growing again, how big do they get? And then what type of workers do they bring back? And that'll be on the next 2 slides, or next set of slides. Okay, so this is the first part of that. So now we're going to look at re-entering firms. So these are firms, these are firms that went away and then came back. And we're going to ask, when they come back, what size do they come back at? 100% of their February employment, 50% of their February employment, 25% of their February employment. And then this is just the CDF of that across all re-entering firms through late May. And so you can see the median firm is coming back at about 25% of its February employment. So it's coming back much smaller. The mean firm is coming in about slightly less than half of their original February side. So these firms are reopening, but reopening at a level smaller than they were when they started. And then when I ask, this is the continuing firms. One other thing, some firms are coming back bigger. You know, you can see about 5% of firms that actually left are coming back at a size bigger. Almost all of them are within 10% of their size. Now, again, some of these firms might be small firms, you know, that had 10 employees that went to 11 or something like that. This is in firm size space, not employment weighted space. Okay, so this is now the small, these are continuing firms. And so now I'm just going to ask for all continuing firms, what size are they relative to where they were in mid-February? And this includes all continuing firms, no other selection. And this is what I showed you before. There's about some continuing firms that are actually bigger. Again, these are in number of firm space, not employment weighted space. So the employment weighted numbers I gave you a little earlier, you know, shifts this up just a tiny bit. But many firms, like the median firm is, you know, about smaller, about 95% of their February size. But there's a lot of firms that are much smaller. And so when the re-entering, now I'm back to re-entering firms. So these are firms that went away and they came back. What types, are they bringing back the same workers? So what I'm plotting here is the share of all workers in the firm when they re-entered. What fraction of them were in the firm in mid-February before they left? And you could see, you know, about 80% of firms are bringing back, you know, at least 85% of all of their workers before. So I'll go further, you know, to a rough approximation, most of re-entering firms are just bringing back all of their recalled workers. Not completely all, because there's always churn in these businesses again, but a lot, the overwhelming majority of re-entry of these firms is going to be in recalling workers. So this is now continuing firms. And so I'm going to look for continuing firms that shrunk meaningfully. And I think the way we did this is shrunk at all. So they had employment losses, and now they have employment gains. And I'm going to ask, of those employment gains, how much are coming from workers that were in the firm of the new workers they added? How many of them were in the firm in mid-February? And you can see, you know, there's some with negative. About 10% of firms are negative. They're growing, and they're growing essentially by just hiring new workers on net, as opposed to bringing back their initial workers. But many firms are bringing back some of their initial workers, even among the continuing growing firms. And so you can see the median firm is on net, you know, bringing back about 80%. They're growing through recalling about 80%, or 80% of their growth is coming from recalling workers. So again, that's kind of a, you know, you're seeing with continuing firms a mix of new hiring and recalling existing workers. For the predominant amount of re-entering firms, they're just bringing back all of their, recalling all of their workers. Okay. Last picture, I'm going to show you two things. I'm going to do something quick on wages, and then we'll be mostly done. So this is just some pictures on job creation and job destruction numbers. So how much on net using the employee level data is going to be workers leaving their firm match, and then how much of it is going to be workers then being rehired, created back into the firms. And like you see in almost all recessions, you're getting a big spike in job destruction. And now within a month later, job destruction rates are slightly back, not completely back to normal levels. So you're seeing some destruction. This is why unemployment rates, claims are still going up. But most of the destructions were concentrated, by the end of March through mid-April. What you also see, consistent with many recessions, you don't see much dip in job creation. A little dip in job creation during the early part. Firms were still hiring some on net. But now you're seeing more of a burst in the job creation as the recession goes along. Okay. We're going to do much more on that. So how much of this is due to recalled workers? We're working on that. So this is stuff we've only been doing over the last week or so. Let me just show you a couple of pictures on wages, and then we're essentially done. So, okay, so in our data, for those who are familiar with John and Ahu's and I's old paper, we have a concept of a base wage. And so a base wage is just going to be the contracted hourly wage for workers paid hourly. And for salaried workers, it's going to be the contracted per period guaranteed salary, which is just their annual salary divided by the annual pay period. So for me, I have a contracted amount of monthly earnings given my contract that adjusts once a year. And things like summer nights, those show up in things like bonuses, which we also measure overtime, performance pay, or not. So any of those extra payments isn't in our concept of a base wage. So everything I'm going to show you now is on this base wage measure. There might be other interesting variation in bonuses and overtime and performance pay. Those come at such a medium run frequency that it's hard to see those adjusting in real time. We also have fringe benefits, which we can see are adjusting or not. But again, we haven't done anything with those. Okay. So the black line is kind of what you saw in the BLS over the last 6 weeks or so. So if you just look at BLS data, average wages in the economy is rising. There was a conjecture that was due to selection effect. We go further and show that conjecture is 100% true. All of it is due to selection effect. So what is the selection effect? The selection effect is that the bottom of the distribution just left the labor market. So average wages for everybody else went up. So all of this is due to a composition effect. The red line is if we follow individual workers over time and just ask what happens to individual workers' wages and put that in an index form. And we see there's no increase whatsoever. And if you go further, there's not even an increase. Normally, if you wait a couple of months, workers are going to get increases just over time from their natural cycle. So then we could go further and look at the wage adjustment distribution over time. And so I'm going to show you two sets of numbers. Numbers for firms in 2019, how they were adjusting their wages. And then I'm going to show you the same thing for 2020. And I'm going to focus on a sample of firms that adjust their wages normally in March through May. So in John and I and Ahu's old paper, some of you have seen this before, if you look at firms over time, most firms adjust the bulk of their wages of their workers in 1 month during the year. Sure, there's off-year adjustments due to promotions or retention, but most firms adjust most of their wages in 1 month. And those months are spread out over the year. Okay, there's always spikes at the beginning of the year, January, April, July, and October always sees more spikes, but there is a chunk of firms who adjust their firms regularly in May and in March. So we're going to take the firms that normally, using historical data, adjust their wages in March and May, and then we're going to ask how many wages did they adjust in 2019 when the labor market was relatively strong, and how much are in 2020. And I'm going to show you two panels. So one is the probability of a wage freeze, that they kept the wages the same. And then the second panel is going to be on the wage cut. Let's start with the wage cut, because I think that's easier for people to comprehend. Historically, firms very rarely cut wages. So if you look at our paper, the AR thing for me and John and Ahu, that about, historically, 2% of workers get a nominal wage cut. That's increased slightly in the Great Recession, and I'll show you that in the Great Recession numbers on the next slide. But normally, no workers get wage cuts. So about 2% of workers were getting wage cuts last year in these firms. This year, we have about 11% of workers got a nominal wage cut. And I'm going to break that out by wage quintile in a second so you can see where the cuts are occurring. This picture over here is wage freeze. So historically, during normal times, nobody's getting a cut. About 25% are getting a freeze. That meant 75% are getting an increase. This year, we only have 45% of workers are getting a freeze. 12% got a cut. That means only about 45% of workers are getting an increase. So you're seeing firms not increasing the wages of their workers, and going further, much more likely to cut in this recession. And if we look at that through the Great Recession, so John and I's other work, about 6% of workers got a wage cut during the Great Recession. This is much bigger than that in this current component. Now, some of these cuts, I'm going to show you in the next slide, are going to be concentrated at the top end of the distribution. Mark, is that you?
Yes. So Princeton, for example, put in a wage freeze for next year, starting from July 1st. Would this show up in your data?
Nope, it wouldn't, but it would once I extend the data to July. Right now, these are only firms that are March and May. So I imagine as we start going on now, and so this is why we focus on firms like March or May. So the Princeton example, the Chicago example, we've already had an announced wage freeze for July. I won't be able to see that in the data until July. Now, why would I look in July? I would then look at Chicago and Princeton, always do their wage adjustments in July in the past. So I'm trying to use a control group of firms that normally adjust their wages during these periods. And the longer it goes on, we'll be able to sweep in more and more firms, the firms that do July, the firms that do September, etc. So those aren't even counted yet, but they're not in the numerator or the denominator as of yet. Okay. This is showing where those wage cuts occur. The wage cuts are predominantly at the higher end of the wage distribution. So these are wage quintiles as measured in early February. And so these are, the fourth quintile is about $25 an hour or so. Again, for salaried people, that's assuming a 40-hour work week. Many of these might be furloughs. So they cut your base wage, but they might also tell you to stay home as well. But it's some nominal wage adjustment on the firm's part. They are able to adjust their wage compensation, but they might ask you to work less as well. But that's part of I can't distinguish that because I can't see hours for the salaried people. Okay, last slide, and then I'm going to conclude. Last thing I want to conclude is, just Marcus asked early on about cross-state variation. And
before you go to that, can I ask one question?
Yeah, of course.
If you're fired and hired back, are you hired back at a lower wage or at the same wage? Did you look at that?
We did not. That is a great thing for us to look at. So we could look now for the recall, whether they're recalling people at below the wage. We can do exactly that. We just never have. That's a fantastic idea. That'll be on our to-do list going forward. John, you're in the background. You wrote that down? I assume yes. Okay. Last slide, last thing that we do. It's just a caveat. There's a lot of papers out there now using cross-state variation to try to see the effectiveness of certain types of policies. I want to give a caution about doing that, and then I'm going to do it. So, the caution is, when you're thinking about total employment, most states did not, most sectors didn't close in most states. So essential services in many states, like manufacturing, construction, professional services, fine, didn't even close at any stage. So, some people have shown, somewhere between, 40 and 50% of employment was in closed sectors. So there's a lot of sectors where you might not expect to see much variation. Even when a state reopens, like Illinois, the timing varies within a state. So Chicago's opening is very different than downstate, and many states had very similar problems. So there are things. So there's not just one number for states in each industry. we already know this, most states opened within a 6-week period, so you don't have a huge amount of variation. And this is the part that, we should all be cautious of, that when states reopen, it tends to be changes in underlying health risks that are changing at the same time, because states say, if we meet these health guidelines, we will start to reopen. Or as you saw recently with Texas, we didn't, things are changing, so we're actually going to slow down our opening. So there's endogenous to other types of variables that could affect employment in the background. So now saying that, I'm going to show you one picture. And so we're going to look at one sector, the food and accommodation sector, where there is variation across states in when restaurants opened. And I'm going to look at 4 states that are large, so I have enough power, that opened late. So Illinois, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Washington had restaurants that didn't start opening until late May after my sample. Some states like Florida, Georgia, and Texas had openings that occurred in late April, early May. In these states, you see a couple of things. One, pre-trends that are kind of similar. Second, not surprising, this should not be overly deep. When states opened up in restaurants, employment in restaurants did increase. Third thing is, even in these opening states, employment in these sectors is still 40% below where it was in mid-February. So while there was a gain, the level is still an order of magnitude below where we started. And finally, even in states that didn't open up, you saw increases in restaurants employment during this period as health conditions were better and firms started improving on takeout options. Again, I think my takeaway from this is, yes, opening almost mechanically is going to have an effect on employment. The effects aren't huge, and to do something actually causal, you have to be worried that the opening might be related to health conditions in the background as well. So that's all I have to say about that. Okay.
Erik, I have a couple of questions. One is that, do you have the job description of the worker as well?
I do
not.
So
for example, oh, you don't? Okay.
I don't. So I can't anything. The only worker character. So I have industry, but I don't have occupation. There's no occupation titles in it. We've been trying to get with occupation titles within the ADP, and they're not collected systematically. And each firm has a different kind of coding thing. So the answer is we just don't have them.
Okay. So do you want to use your concluding slides?
Yeah, okay, I'm concluding, which is everything I just done. Unprecedented paid employment declines, concentrated among low-wage workers, small firm women. Employment increased meetingly during May. There is selection effect in wages. There's lots of freezes and wage cuts. Shutdown is important, but some firms are being re-entering and growing businesses mostly recall previous employees. But in continuing firms, you are seeing some new hires outside the firm, and not surprisingly, state employment increases when states reopen, but those effects are small. That's all I got.
Great. So thanks a lot. It's very fascinating data and a nice big picture, clear picture of what's going on. I wanted to ask David Ennis, he's asking, can you check whether firms try to weed out lower productivity workers?
Weed out is always hard. So
here is an idea.
Yep.
If you look at the past increases of the workers, the wage increases for the last 5 years, there might be some workers who didn't get much of a wage increase because they're not so productive. Are these the workers which are most likely to be fired and least likely to be rehired?
Yes, we had some of that already. I mean, so we know the bottom part is most likely to be fired. We didn't condition on past trends before. John, you could get in here and answer. Ryan, you come on in too, so you guys can answer now.
Yeah, no, we haven't done that yet. It's a good idea because you would think that if there's some sort of learning about worker quality going on in the background, you're going to see wage increases for those kinds of guys, whereas you wouldn't see them if you're learning they're not a high type. We should try that.
To see whether you use this crisis also as an excuse to fire workers which you wanted to get rid of anyway as a company. And
yeah. So certainly anecdotally, you hear people say things like, never waste a recession, because for exactly this reason, you have these workers, it's challenging to fire them, maybe less so in the US than in Europe, but Yeah, anecdotally, it seems to be true. So we should look and see if we can do something more systematic on that.
Is it fair to say that one big message is that high wage earners, they get a wage cut, but low wage earners, they get fired? Is this one of the main messages from, I mean, out of the many other messages of your paper? And in terms of getting social security or getting some security, job security and all that, it seems like the low wage earners, they have way more risk to bear because it's solving an extensive margin rather than an intensive margin.
That appears to be the case. That appears to be the case in this most recent period, but also in some of the previous work that Erik and I were doing. I don't know if Erik made it into the final draft, but we found that to be the case in 2008 to 2016 as well. You know, part of that might be the structure of compensation is different for these people. Part of that might be binding minimum wages. I mean, we should do a bit more work to figure out exactly what's going on there, but it does seem to be a pattern that has persisted over the last 12 years or so, and especially now.
So Amy Chen would like to know whether there's some connection to having children in the household. Do you have any data where you say, oh, there's a little children in the household and hence they are less likely to be rehired, or some features along that, or some gender imbalances? So you had some chart on gender, but what about young children?
Yeah,
you probably don't have data on that. No,
it's a great question, because certainly if you were to speculate, after we've told you that industry is not what's driving the gender difference, if you were to speculate on one thing that might be, you might think childcare would be important. We don't, I mean, what we see is everything that goes onto a person's paycheck. So on your paycheck, it doesn't say you have X many kids. There might be some information on taxes, you know, tax exemptions or things like that that we're looking into, but we don't, it might be a bit noisy. So we're thinking about it basically, but we don't have anything on it yet.
We don't have a ready kids thing in our data.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to do some proxies of some sort.
I see, but tax considerations might be, because when you do the payroll, you see whether there's some allowance for kids, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. How far back do the wages go? I mean, I found this selection aspect so striking that actually, if you look at the red line, it was essentially controlling for the selection. The wages didn't increase at all. Even when everybody said, oh, the labor market is doing so well, now finally we see some wage increase. And you're arguing it's all a selection issue. How far back can your data go? Can you go to the 90s, the ADP data, or is it, how far can you, no?
The worker level pay data goes back to May of 2008. And so we don't quite have a pre-period on the Great Recession, but we can look at what happened during the Great Recession.
But just to answer Marcus's question, that picture I showed was only from like beginning of January or mid-February.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, so in our other paper, the one that we do see lots of wage growth, even conditional on fixed effects. Mm-hmm. So in our other paper, we do the period for there 2018 or 2008 to 2016. So we never did the 17 and 18, but our paper that we have that's working through the publication process goes through 2016.
But it's worth noting on these pictures that we're showing on the wage cuts and wage freezes, those are all conditional on staying on the job. So in the Great Recession, for instance, if you were to do the selection correction, just look at people who stay on the same job, you're going to see a slight increase. But a lot of people in the recession might have switched jobs, and when they switch jobs, are much more likely to get wage cuts as well. And so if you look at the same set of people who are employed by any firm during the Great Recession, you might see wages going down and coming back up. Even if you look conditional on staying on the job, they're rising.
Mm-hmm. So another set of questions by Charlie Brown and Amy Jen are all about salary of half-time or part-time workers. Do you have anything, anything you can say on that dimension?
So we don't have a specific part-time, full-time flag. The data come to us, what we see by wages is the per period contracted pay. So if you're paid salaried, we see how much you're paid every pay period. So if you're paid weekly, how much you're paid every week. Bi-weekly, how much you're paid every 2 weeks. If you're hourly, we see how much you're paid on an hourly wage, your actual hourly wage. And so if part-time is just you're working fewer hours, for those hourly workers, it shouldn't really affect that wage unless it's affecting the wage. For salaried guys, it can come in a couple of different ways. One, it can be that they adjust that contracted payment rate, that weekly wage, and that will show up as a base wage cut in our measure. Another thing that might happen is that people will be paid less than their contracted pay. So we can look at that as well and think of it as maybe a furlough. We didn't show it today, but that did increase by what, 2 percentage points? Do you remember the number, Eric? At the worst of the crisis for these salaried guys.
And one other thing, in terms of job loss was slightly more concentrated among low hours workers. Mm-hmm. So we had a plot, we didn't show it today, but we have total hours fall and then total employment fall, and the hours falls in the aggregate were less, and that's because the correlation was the people who lost a job were just low hours types of people. And so some of the loss could be coming from part-time, and we could break that down for hourly workers because we know actually the hours that they're working in this steady state before. So we can take the average of people who normally work, less than 30 hours for people who work normally more than 30 hours or something like that in terms of employment losses.
So Thomas Nakonovich would like to know, and I think it's hotly debated in the media as well, do you have the unemployment insurance benefits, so UI benefits? And can you see, in some cases, the unemployment benefits are larger than the wages, and that's why, you go for unemployment benefits. Do you have can you match your data with the unemployment benefits somehow, or is this?
So we can certainly match it with sort of local rules. And then we can probably do some calculation about what people's, full take-up unemployment insurance benefit might be. But we do not directly observe unemployment insurance in our data because it's not something that's paid by the firm, by the payroll processor. But maybe we can look a little bit more at that, doing some matching on loss.
Could it be that the unemployment benefits relative to the wages for the low-income workers are much bigger, and that's why there's a tendency to go for unemployment? And for the high paid, there's a big gap, and they didn't go for the unemployment benefits.
Eric, do you have thoughts on this, or?
I mean, it could be. I mean, we could try to do match, as John said, more. This is just my personal opinion. I just can't imagine that's a first order thing in the world where the labor market, there's so much slack out there and people have heterogeneity in both the taste for these types of things and at the same time that we know that these gains are going to be temporary. I just can't imagine it's a first order thing, but that's just a conjecture.
Okay, thanks. I have another question which came to my mind is that how up to date is your data, and can you trade on it? Can you sell your data to hedge funds who will say,
Ryan, do you want to get in here?
Announces it. You'll see the data already.
I'm going to let you take that as the Fed representative.
I'll say, well, I do not represent the Fed.
I know.
But I mean, the answer is probably yes. We've actually even wondered if we should try to write a paper figuring out what we have found in past work. We built, the team I'm on inside the Fed, we built an index that was designed to be similar in methodology to the CES, the BLS monthly jobs report number. And when we built that index, we found that it will improve forecasts of the BLS number, even if you take into account market expectations and other stuff that's sort of known at the time that the report comes out. And so we can improve the forecasts. It's not a huge improvement. Under normal circumstances, it's not a huge improvement. However, if we think about what's been going on lately or what happened in the Great Recession, it actually seems to have a little more value there. And the best example is the May jobs report. So in the May jobs report, the consensus, I think, was something around -8 million. The actual number ended up coming in around 3 million, 3.5 million in the non-seasonally adjusted. And the number we had in our paid employment number was 3.7 million. So, orders of magnitude better than any private forecaster. So there probably is value, but of course, as Fed employees, we are not.
And to be fair, ADP puts out their national employment report where they try to predict the BLS number month to month, and they try to do it a couple of days earlier. And for them, they just want to get into the public discourse. For ADP sharing the data with us as researchers is they had the option to think about that as well, and they chose that. I think that's more just for the research side They want to try to increase the discourse, and they've been fantastic on every one of these dimensions in terms of allowing us access. When you come to them with an idea, I really want to understand nominal wage rigidities and how those could affect macro things in a normal time. Like I went to them in 2014 to try to get the access to data. They were very receptive to us and our geeky questions. So.
Very good. Thanks a lot for this fantastic presentation. We have the tradition in our webinar series that we end at a positive note. So anybody, John, Ryan, or Erik, if you have some positive aspect from the crisis on the labor market, let's focus on labor, where you say there's a huge improvement or there's a tendency to improvement. Now is your chance to make a positive
Ryan,
statement.
You go first.
Well, I have to say, I think that, if you saw the charts that Erik put up, the last couple of weeks of data actually don't look so great. They're sort of leveling off a little bit. And there's some other high frequency indicators out there in the public that are showing even a little bit of a downtick in some of these states that are having. So instead, let me say something
positive guy, just in perspective, he's our most positive one.
What I can say that I think is positive is not so much about the economics, but just about, I think the improvements in economic measurement since the last crisis are really being shown here. So nobody had ADP data in the last crisis, nor did we have these other data sources folks are using, Homebase, Open Table, SafeGraph.
Raj is doing.
So I would say that from this, and I'm involved in both measurement and forecasting, and I think from that standpoint, we're at a time when our data, our usual data sources, which are very good and high quality, and yet still are under a tremendous amount of stress right now. The BLS changed part of their CES methodology 2 months ago because of all this craziness. So we're at a time when there's big challenges facing policymakers and facing measurement, and I think it's very reassuring that there are these private sector data sources. And because this sort of combined team has been working on this for a few years, we sort of were ready to roll these things out. And I think that is a positive thing, that I think we have a better idea of what's going on in real time now than we have in past recessions.
I have one final question because it's such an interesting question. Do you see any difference between unionized workers firms and non-unionized firms in terms of firing and rehiring, in terms of wage cut? Do you have the data, whether the firm does the unionized workers or not?
They have nothing they collected that allows me to see whether they're unionized or not. But what I do know is that most of the sectors hit hardest tend to be sectors that aren't unionized. Unlike other past, it's not like the restaurant industry is overly unionized as a whole compared to things like manufacturing or the public sector. And so I don't know that. We saw the pictures by industry, but most of the industry losses are not in sectors that are traditionally unionized. But I don't have measures of industry unionization at the firm level.
There's no way to get this data in this sense.
At the firm, you think about when you contract with ADP, do you tell them if you're unionized or not? So all things we have access to is what you would tell your payroll provider. And so most of those don't have questions.
But you might be able to back it out from if certain contract structure follow very much some, unionized.
There could be something on the payroll somewhere if you have to pay union dues. So if they removed union dues from your paycheck, we might be able to kind of see line items for union dues. Might be the only thing I could think of.
Thanks again for a fantastic paper. I think a lot of stuff to be done with this data, and it gives us way deeper insights what we could do compared to what we could do earlier, and will guide not only labor but macro and many fields in economics. Thanks
As
a lot.
Macroeconomists, we hope so.
Yes, I'm pretty sure you're right on that one.
Okay.
I hope to see you soon. Let me do some advertising for the folks who are still here. Monday is the next one, 12:30 with Arvind Krishnamurthy. Please come again, ask great questions as this time, and hope to see you soon on Monday. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.